a black executive, freshly promoted to a high-ranking position at a global tech firm, arrives at a five-star hotel for a business conference. Confident and poised, she steps into the lobby. But within minutes, a front desk clerk accuses her of trespassing, refusing to check her in despite her reservation. The humiliation unfolds in front of a stunned crowd. But what happens next leaves the entire hotel staff scrambling and sets off a series of events no one could have foreseen. Stay with me, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about dignity, power, and justice. Before we dive in, comment below where you're tuning in from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that need to be told. Let's get started. It began on what seemed like just another day. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of LaGuardia Airport's main terminal, casting fractured light onto the tiled floor. Annabelle Turner stood near Gate 17, her black leather carry-on resting against her leg, her hands folded neatly around her boarding pass. The muted hum of the airport buzzed around her. Mothers herding children toward bathrooms. Businessmen shouting into phones. Announcements that faded into white noise. She had flown countless times before, but today carried an unfamiliar weight, as if the air itself braced for something unspoken. Annabelle was dressed simply, a crisp white blouse tucked into tailored gray slacks, her favorite navy blazer adding a touch of elegance. It was a presentation her mother would have been proud of. "Dress like the world can't afford to underestimate you," she'd always said, and Annabelle had learned to do exactly that. As the first boarding call for Flight 324 crackled over the loudspeakers, she made her way toward the gate, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The gate agent glanced at her briefly before returning to their terminal, waving her forward without comment. Annabelle noted the indifference in their eyes. It wasn't hostility, but it wasn't warmth either. Just a subtle apathy, like a casual erasure of her presence. She presented her boarding pass with a polite smile. "Good morning." The agent, a young woman with a badge that read, M. Harmon, scanned the pass and paused. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she glanced up at Annabelle, her expression unreadable. "This is a first-class ticket," she said, more a statement than question. "Yes, it is," Annabelle replied, her tone calm. M. Harmon's lips tightened into a small, practiced smile, but her eyes carried the hint of something else. Doubt, maybe, or surprise. Without another word, she handed the ticket back and gestured toward the jet bridge. Annabelle thanked her and walked on, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. The first-class cabin greeted her with its usual air of curated luxury. The muted tones of cream and gold, the soft leather seats, the faint scent of fresh coffee, all designed to create a space that felt both exclusive and effortless. Annabelle found her seat near the window, 2A, and placed her bag carefully in the overhead bin. As she sat down, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. She had earned this, every inch of it. The flight attendants began their pre-flight rituals, distributing menus and offering pre-takeoff drinks. A tall woman with neatly styled hair and a name tag that read, Linda, approached her row. Her smile was polite, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, ma'am. Can I get you something to drink?" Annabelle returned the smile. "Champagne, please." Linda's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before she nodded. "I'll be right back." Annabelle leaned back, watching the cabin as Linda moved down the aisle. The other passengers seemed to blend into the muted decor. Men in tailored suits typing furiously on laptops. A couple speaking in hushed tones over the edge of a glossy magazine. No one looked at her directly, but she could feel their awareness, like a faint pressure against her skin. When Linda returned, it wasn't with champagne. Instead, she held a glass of water. She placed it on Annabelle's tray with a practiced motion, then straightened and said, "We're out of champagne for pre-takeoff service." Annabelle's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her voice steady. "That's strange. I saw champagne being served just now." Linda blinked, her polite mask slipping ever so slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we only serve it to select passengers before takeoff." The words landed with a soft thud between them. They were spoken without malice, yet they carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. Annabelle met Linda's gaze, holding it steady. "And what selection criteria do you use?" Annabelle asked, her tone even. Linda's smile returned, but it was tighter now. Her discomfort evident. "I'll check with the galley," she said quickly before turning and walking away. The minutes stretched on, and Annabelle's gaze drifted to the aisle across from her. A man in his late 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a gold watch glinting on his wrist, was handed a flute of champagne. He smiled at the attendant, lifting the glass in a casual toast before sipping. Annabelle turned her attention back to the window, her fingers tightening slightly around the armrest. She wasn't new to moments like these. The quiet, careful ways the world questioned her belonging. But today, something about the weight of it felt sharper, heavier, as though it carried the accumulated echoes of countless other moments just like it. Linda returned, her smile strained, and placed a champagne flute on Annabelle's tray. "Here you go, ma'am," she said, her tone clipped. "Thank you," Annabelle replied, lifting the glass with deliberate poise. She took a small sip, letting the cool bubbles settle on her tongue. It wasn't just champagne, it was a quiet reclamation. A moment of saying without words, "I am exactly where I'm meant to be." The tension in the cabin seemed to shift subtly. Nearby passengers stole glances, their curiosity tinged with something more complicated. Annabelle set the glass down and leaned back in her seat, her mind already moving past the incident, though she knew its echo would linger. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its slow taxi to the runway. Annabelle gazed out at the expanse of concrete and sky, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. In the stillness of that moment, she felt a flicker of something. Determination, perhaps, or the calm before the storm. For now, she let the plane carry her forward. But she knew the real journey was only just beginning. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, and the flight attendants began their well-rehearsed dance of service. The hum of the engines mixed with the soft clinking of glassware, punctuated occasionally by the murmur of conversation. Annabelle watched as the cabin settled into its routine. The businessman across the aisle typed furiously on his laptop, while a younger couple a few rows ahead leaned close, their heads almost touching as they shared a set of headphones. The first-class cabin was a picture of understated privilege, yet Annabelle could feel the undercurrent, the unspoken tension that always seemed to follow her. A different flight attendant approached with a tray of appetizers. Her name tag read, Rebecca, and she carried herself with the practiced ease of someone used to diffusing discomfort. When she reached Annabelle's row, Rebecca hesitated ever so slightly, her eyes scanning Annabelle's face before offering the tray. "Would you like an hors d'oeuvre, ma'am?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Thank you," Annabelle replied, selecting a small plate with a practiced grace. She placed it on her tray table, careful to keep her movements unhurried. She was keenly aware of how often her actions were scrutinized, even in small, mundane moments. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. The meal service began shortly after, and Annabelle noted how Rebecca's demeanor shifted as she interacted with the other passengers. There was a warmth, an ease in her tone when she spoke to the man in 2C, offering him wine recommendations as if they were old friends. When she stopped at Annabelle's row, the friendliness dimmed, the smile was still there, but it was thinner, less genuine, as if Rebecca were performing politeness rather than inhabiting it. "Would you like the salmon or the chicken, ma'am?" she asked. "The salmon, please," Annabelle replied, her voice calm but steady. She watched Rebecca jot down the choice and move on without comment, the subtle chill in her demeanor lingering like a faint draft. Annabelle took a deep breath, centering herself. She wasn't imagining it, she never imagined it. The tension began to rise during dessert service. A man 2 rows ahead, a silver-haired executive type with a booming voice, waved Rebecca over. "Miss, this wine tastes off," he declared, holding up his glass. Rebecca responded with immediate concern, replacing his drink and apologizing profusely. The exchange was brief, but Annabelle noticed how Rebecca lingered, ensuring the man's satisfaction with a kind of deference that felt strikingly absent in her own interactions. As Rebecca approached Annabelle's row again, Annabelle decided to test the waters. "Excuse me," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Could I see the wine list again? I'd like to select something different." Rebecca paused, her expression flickering with something Annabelle recognized all too well. Hesitation laced with annoyance. "Of course, ma'am," she said, her tone clipped. She retrieved the wine list from the galley and handed it to Annabelle without a word. Annabelle scanned the list, her fingers tracing the embossed lettering. "I'll have the Chardonnay. Thank you." Rebecca nodded curtly and disappeared. Returning moments later with the glass, she placed it on the tray table with a mechanical smile and walked away without further comment. As the cabin lights dimmed for the evening, Annabelle leaned back in her seat, her mind replaying the small moments that had unfolded. None of them, taken alone, were overt acts of hostility. But together, they formed a pattern, a mosaic of subtle exclusions and quiet affronts that carried the unmistakable weight of something deeper. The businessman across the aisle caught her eye. He offered a small nod, as if to acknowledge her. But there was something in his gaze that made Annabelle pause. Was it sympathy, curiosity, or something else entirely? She nodded back, her expression neutral, and turned her attention to the window. Outside, the world was a sea of darkness. The stars scattered like pinpricks of light. Annabelle's reflection stared back at her, composed but weary. She thought of her parents, of the stories they had told her about navigating spaces where they were neither welcomed nor wanted. Her father's quiet warnings about keeping her head down, her mother's insistence on holding it high. Both lessons had shaped her. But moments like these reminded her how difficult it was to find the balance between the two. The cabin was quiet now, most passengers either asleep or engrossed in their devices. Annabelle closed her eyes, willing herself to rest, but her thoughts raced on. She thought about the small injustices that accumulated over time, like grains of sand in an hourglass. They were so easy to dismiss, to explain away, until one day the glass was full, and the weight of it all became impossible to ignore. She was shaken from her thoughts by a faint commotion near the galley. Voices, hushed but urgent, drifted toward her. She opened her eyes, her gaze sharpening as she tried to make out the words. It was Rebecca and another flight attendant. A man this time, exchanging tense whispers. "I told you, she's watching everything," Rebecca said, her voice low but laced with frustration. "Well, maybe you should have handled it better," the man replied, his tone edged with irritation. "You know these kinds of passengers take things personally." Annabelle's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay still. She knew the kind of passengers they were talking about. They always did. The conversation ended abruptly, and Rebecca stepped back into the cabin, her face carefully composed once more. Annabelle watched her move down the aisle, her interactions with the other passengers seemingly unaltered. But Annabelle saw the cracks, the subtle shift in her posture, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Annabelle turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her once more. The tension was building, layer by layer, moment by moment. She could feel it pressing against her, heavy and unrelenting, but she wouldn't let it break her. Not yet. The hours ticked by, and the flight stretched on, weaving its way across the darkened expanse of sky. The quiet hum of the engines was punctuated by the occasional chime of a call button or the soft rustle of passengers shifting in their seats. Annabelle sat motionless, her back straight against the plush first-class seat, her eyes scanning the cabin like a sentinel. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, on alert in a space that demanded her silence. The experience of holding tension in her body while maintaining a calm exterior was as familiar to her as breathing. She didn't need to turn her head to feel the weight of unspoken judgments hovering just beyond her line of sight. The cabin crew began their mid-flight rounds, offering blankets and refreshments to passengers who were still awake. Rebecca approached Annabelle's row again, her steps slower than before, her movements more hesitant. When she reached Annabelle, she stopped, her professional mask firmly in place. "Can I offer you a blanket, ma'am?" she asked, her tone neutral, as if rehearsed. "No, thank you," Annabelle replied evenly. She didn't look up, and didn't offer Rebecca the satisfaction of meeting her gaze. She sensed the attendant hesitate for a fraction of a second before moving on. Across the aisle, the businessman stirred. His laptop had been replaced with a hardcover book. Though his eyes didn't seem to be focused on the words, he cast another glance in Annabelle's direction, his expression unreadable. She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, could almost feel the unasked questions lingering in the air between them. A subtle tension had begun to permeate the cabin, creeping in like a draft through an open window. Annabelle noticed it in the way the other passengers avoided her gaze, in the quiet that settled whenever she moved. It was the kind of silence that wasn't born of peace but of discomfort. A collective unease that had no voice, no direction. She had felt this silence before. In boardrooms where she was the only black woman at the table. In upscale restaurants where the maitre d' greeted her with thinly veiled surprise. In her own neighborhood, where new neighbors sometimes hesitated before asking, "So, how long have you lived here?" It wasn't always about what was said. It was about what wasn't. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing turbulence ahead. The seatbelt sign blinked on, its small yellow glow a reminder of how little control anyone truly had at 35,000 feet. Annabelle fastened her belt, her movements deliberate. She could feel the slight tremor in the air as the plane began to shift. A reminder that even the most carefully constructed systems could falter. Rebecca returned to the aisle, her expression tight as she checked on passengers. She paused at Annabelle's row again, this time holding a tray of water bottles. Her hand hovered for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Would you like some water, ma'am?" Annabelle looked up, meeting Rebecca's eyes for the first time since their earlier exchange. She held her gaze, steady and unflinching, until the attendant shifted on her feet. "No, thank you," Annabelle said, her voice calm but firm. Rebecca nodded and moved on, but the unease in her posture lingered. Annabelle watched her retreat down the aisle, her shoulders slightly hunched as if under a weight she couldn't quite name. As the turbulence intensified, so did the tension in the cabin. Passengers gripped their armrests, their eyes darting toward the windows as the plane shuddered. Annabelle remained still, her breathing steady. She wasn't afraid of turbulence. She had weathered far worse storms than this. Storms that rattled not just the body but the soul. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward, his voice cutting through the hum of the engines. "Excuse me," he said, his tone laced with feigned casualness. "Are you traveling for work?" Annabelle turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. She could see the curiosity behind his question, the subtle calculation in his eyes. He wasn't just asking about her trip. He was asking about her presence, about why she was here, in this space, beside him. "Yes," she replied simply, her voice measured. She didn't elaborate. She didn't owe him that. The man nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. He hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, before leaning back in his seat. The plane jolted again, a sudden drop that drew a gasp from a passenger a few rows back. Rebecca reappeared, moving quickly down the aisle to reassure the nervous travelers. Annabelle watched her, noting the way she avoided eye contact as she passed. It was a small thing, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She thought about the whispers she had overheard earlier, about Rebecca's comment that people like her always took things personally. The words replayed in her mind, sharp and cutting, each syllable adding another layer to the invisible wall between them. Annabelle had learned long ago not to let words like those pierce too deeply. But that didn't mean they didn't leave marks. As the turbulence began to subside, Annabelle closed her eyes, allowing the rhythmic hum of the engines to wash over her. But her mind was far from quiet. She thought about the unspoken rules of spaces like this, about the delicate balance she was forced to maintain every time she entered them. It wasn't just about surviving the moment. It was about challenging it, about pushing back against the quiet, insidious forces that sought to keep her in her place. When she opened her eyes, the cabin was still. The tension remained, but it was quieter now, a low simmer rather than a rolling boil. Annabelle sat up straighter, her resolve hardening. She had navigated these waters before, and she would do it again. Because some battles couldn't be avoided. They could only be fought. The morning light was just beginning to creep across the cabin when Annabelle noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The turbulence had passed, but the air still felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The passengers who had been watching her earlier had now retreated into their books or screens. But Annabelle could sense their lingering attention. Furtive, veiled, but undeniable. Across the aisle, the businessman was pretending to read. His eyes flicked over the same line in his book, over and over again, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Annabelle caught his glance once, brief and hesitant, before he quickly looked away. She smiled faintly, a wry acknowledgement of the silent game they were playing. Rebecca reappeared, her steps measured, a smile plastered across her face. This time, she wasn't alone. Another attendant, a man with an easy charm and a polished demeanor, followed her. His name tag read, Elliot. He carried himself with the kind of confidence that only came from years of navigating first-class cabins filled with demanding passengers. "Good morning, ma'am," Elliot said, his voice warm and practiced. "I understand there may have been some confusion earlier. Is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable?" Annabelle looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She saw through the veneer of his politeness, the carefully cultivated mask of customer service. He wasn't here to help her, he was here to manage her. "No, thank you," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm perfectly fine." Elliot's smile didn't falter, but she caught the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He shifted slightly, his weight moving from one foot to the other. Behind him, Rebecca watched silently, her expression carefully neutral. "I just want to make sure you're enjoying your experience with us." Elliot pressed. His tone was smooth, but there was an edge to it. A subtle implication that this conversation was more about diffusing tension than addressing it. Annabelle leaned back in her seat, folding her hands in her lap. "I'm sure you do," she said, her gaze steady, "but you should be asking yourself why this conversation is necessary in the first place." Elliot blinked, his mask slipping for just a moment. He opened his mouth as if to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he nodded and took a step back. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to let us know," he said, retreating to the galley with Rebecca close behind. Annabelle exhaled slowly, her composure intact. She had seen this routine before. The sudden concern, the overly polite offers of assistance. It wasn't about making things right, it was about making things quiet. About ensuring that people like her didn't disrupt the carefully curated illusion of civility that first-class cabins demanded. The businessman across the aisle closed his book and leaned forward slightly. "That was something," he said, his tone cautious. Annabelle turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "Was it?" she asked, her voice even. He hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. "I just mean, you handled that well. Better than most people would have." She smiled faintly, a trace of humor in her eyes. "You'd be surprised what people can handle when they don't have a choice." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Still, it's impressive. I don't know if I could have stayed that calm." Annabelle regarded him for a moment before responding. "Calm doesn't mean unaffected," she said quietly. "It just means I've learned where to place my anger." The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet, but the tension in the cabin remained, a low hum beneath the surface. Annabelle could feel it in the way the attendants moved. Their smiles stretched thin, their voices a touch too bright. She could see it in the way the other passengers avoided her gaze, their discomfort manifesting in their silence. When the plane began its descent, Rebecca reappeared, her smile now almost brittle. "We'll be landing shortly," she said, her tone clipped. "Please let us know if you need anything else." Annabelle met her gaze, her expression calm but piercing. "Thank you," she said, her voice laced with quiet authority. "I'll be sure to do that." Rebecca nodded quickly and retreated down the aisle, her shoulders stiff. Annabelle watched her go, a quiet determination settling over her. This flight was nearly over, but the battle it represented was far from finished. As the plane touched down, Annabelle felt the familiar mix of relief and resolve. She had navigated another space that wasn't built for her, another unspoken challenge to her existence. But she knew this was just one chapter in a much larger story. She straightened her scarf, lifted her carry-on, and prepared to step back into a world that often seemed determined to test her resolve. But she also knew that she wasn't stepping into it alone. Every moment of quiet defiance, every refusal to be diminished, was part of a legacy, one that stretched far beyond the confines of a single flight. The airport terminal was a world unto itself, bright, bustling, and carefully choreographed. Annabelle stepped onto the polished tile floor, her carry-on trailing behind her. The air smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel, a mix she found oddly comforting. Around her, passengers moved with purpose, their paths weaving in and out of each other like the threads of an intricate tapestry. Yet, even here, she could feel it, the unspoken weight of being watched. Annabelle's heels clicked softly as she walked toward the baggage claim. A young family hurried past her, the mother clutching a toddler to her chest while the father balanced a stack of precariously tilting suitcases. They didn't look at her, but an older woman standing near the arrivals board did, her gaze lingering a moment too long. It wasn't hostility exactly, just curiosity laced with something sharper. Annabelle didn't flinch under the scrutiny. She had grown accustomed to being both visible and invisible at once. Near the carousel, a man in a navy suit stood tapping at his phone. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, but Annabelle recognized the tension in his shoulders. He was waiting for someone. As she passed, his eyes flicked up briefly, and she caught the barest hint of a frown. It was a small thing, fleeting and insignificant, but it lodged in her mind like a splinter. These moments always did. They were like whispers in the background of her life, too quiet to demand attention, but loud enough to remind her they were there. She retrieved her luggage quickly, her movements practiced and efficient. She had learned long ago to keep her interactions in these spaces brief. The longer she lingered, the more likely she was to encounter something, or someone, who would test her patience. As Annabelle approached the exit, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw her assistant's name on the screen. "Hi, Sarah," she answered, her tone brisk. "Ms. Hayes," Sarah began, her voice hesitant. "I just got an email from the firm. There's been a situation." Annabelle stopped in her tracks, her grip tightening on her phone. "What kind of situation?" "It's about the Anderson account," Sarah said, the words tumbling out quickly. "They've requested to meet with you directly. Apparently, they weren't happy with the preliminary proposal." Annabelle frowned. The Anderson account was one of the firm's most important clients, and she had spent weeks crafting a strategy she knew was airtight. If they were unhappy, it wasn't because of the work. "I'll handle it," she said firmly. "Set up a meeting for tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied. "And, Ms. Hayes?" "Yes?" There was a note in the email, Sarah said, her voice dropping slightly. "They specifically asked for you to bring someone more aligned with their perspective." Annabelle felt her stomach tighten. The meaning was clear, though unspoken. More aligned wasn't about perspective. It was about appearance. "I see," Annabelle said, her voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll take care of it." She ended the call and slipped her phone back into her pocket. Around her, the terminal buzzed with activity, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. But for Annabelle, the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. She had faced this before. Clients who smiled politely but questioned her authority. Who nodded along in meetings while looking past her to someone else. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her face, grounding her. She flagged down a taxi and slid into the backseat, giving the driver her destination. As the car pulled away, Annabelle stared out the window, her reflection superimposed over the cityscape. She thought of the Andersons, their carefully worded note, and the unspoken barriers that still existed despite the years of progress people liked to claim. The car stopped at a red light, and Annabelle's attention was drawn to a mural on a nearby building. It depicted a group of children holding hands, their faces painted in a kaleidoscope of colors. Below them, bold letters spelled out the phrase, "Our differences make us stronger." She smiled faintly at the irony. The sentiment was beautiful, but the reality was often far less so. The world wasn't built to embrace differences. It was built to smooth them out, to erase them or turn them into something palatable. By the time she arrived at her hotel, Annabelle had regained her composure. She moved through the lobby with her usual grace, nodding politely to the staff who greeted her. But inside, her mind was already working, strategizing her next move. She wouldn't let the Andersons, or anyone else, define her worth. If they wanted to question her place at the table, she would show them exactly why she deserved to be there. And she wouldn't do it for their approval or validation. She would do it for herself. For every person who had ever been made to feel less than. And for the younger version of herself who had once doubted she could rise above it all. The morning arrived shrouded in a cool mist. The kind of weather that made the city feel subdued. As though holding its breath, Annabelle stepped out of her hotel and into the waiting car, her leather briefcase resting neatly on her lap. The driver, a quiet man with salt and pepper hair, offered her a polite nod in the rearview mirror. "Good morning," he said softly, as though reluctant to break the silence. Annabelle returned the greeting, though her mind was already elsewhere. The Anderson meeting loomed large in her thoughts. It wasn't the proposal itself that weighed on her. She knew the work was flawless. What lingered was the note, the insinuation, more aligned with their perspective. The words were so carefully chosen they practically oozed condescension. The car wove through the city streets, and Annabelle stared out at the passing buildings, her reflection faint in the window. She thought of all the times she'd walked into rooms where the assumption of her unworthiness preceded her. It was never spoken outright, of course. It hid behind veiled compliments and polite exclusions, in the way her suggestions were interesting until someone else echoed them. This morning would be no different. The polite walls of power were always built to keep certain people on the outside looking in. When the car pulled up to the Anderson building, Annabelle stepped out with the kind of poise she had cultivated over years of navigating these spaces. The receptionist greeted her with a practiced smile, but the stiffness in her posture was unmistakable. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes," the woman said, her voice clipped. "The Anderson team is expecting you. I'll escort you to the conference room." Annabelle followed her through the gleaming lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She could feel the weight of curious eyes, staff members who glanced her way and quickly looked elsewhere. She walked tall, her head high, refusing to let their silent judgments reach her. The conference room was spacious and impeccably designed, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a stunning view of the city. At the head of the long table sat Charles Anderson himself, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. His handshake was firm but fleeting, and when he gestured for Annabelle to sit, it was with the kind of politeness that felt more like dismissal. The meeting began with pleasantries, the kind that made Annabelle feel like a performer in a carefully choreographed play. The Andersons asked questions, but not of her, always directing their inquiries to her junior associate, Michael, who had accompanied her. Michael was competent and capable, but Annabelle had led this project from the start. It was her vision, her strategy, yet they treated her like a figurehead. At one point, Charles leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone deceptively pleasant, "I must say, your presence here is refreshing. It's not often we see someone with your perspective in our field." Annabelle's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table, but her face remained calm. She recognized the statement for what it was. Not a compliment, but a carefully veiled reminder that she was an anomaly in their world. "Perspective is what drives innovation, Mr. Anderson," she replied evenly, meeting his gaze. "I'm confident our strategy will exceed your expectations." Charles nodded, but the faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth betrayed his skepticism. The meeting dragged on, filled with moments like these. Small jabs wrapped in civility. Annabelle endured them with the kind of grace that came from years of practice. But inside, she felt the familiar burn of frustration. It wasn't just the Andersons, it was the system they represented. One that demanded she prove herself over and over again, no matter how many times she had already done so. As the meeting drew to a close, Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This has been very productive," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I'd like to propose a slight adjustment to your team." Annabelle's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "We'd like Michael to take the lead on this project moving forward." Charles continued, his words deliberate. "You've laid a solid foundation, of course. But we think Michael's approach might be more relatable to our stakeholders." The room fell silent. Michael looked at Annabelle, his face a mix of discomfort and guilt. He knew what this was, just as she did, but he said nothing. Annabelle's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had a choice to make: push back and risk being labeled difficult, or let it go and sacrifice her hard-earned authority. Neither option was appealing, but she had been here before, and she knew how to navigate these waters. With a measured smile, she leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Charles. "I appreciate your feedback, Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice steady, "but I must respectfully disagree. I've led this project from its inception, and I believe my continued involvement is crucial to its success. Of course, Michael will remain a key member of the team, but I intend to see this through personally." Her words hung in the air, a quiet assertion of power that left no room for argument. Charles blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, he said nothing, and Annabelle could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. Finally, he gave a tight smile and nodded. "Of course, Ms. Hayes," he said, "we trust your judgment." As Annabelle left the Anderson building, she felt the weight of the morning lifting slightly. She had won this round. But the battle was far from over. The polite walls of power hadn't crumbled. They rarely did, but she had found a crack. And that was enough for now. Back in the car, she stared out the window. Her reflection sharper this time. She thought of all the moments like this one. The small victories that were hard won and easily overlooked. They mattered, even if they didn't always feel like it. The city passed by in a blur. But Annabelle's focus remained clear. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who came after her. For the people who deserved to walk into these rooms without having to justify their presence. And she wouldn't stop until those polite walls came down for good. The evening was heavy with the kind of silence that only comes after a storm. Though the storm itself wasn't weather. It was the undercurrent of confrontation that Annabelle had navigated all day. The Anderson meeting was behind her. But its residue lingered, clinging to her thoughts like a stubborn dog. She sat in her hotel room, the city's lights twinkling faintly beyond the glass, a stark contrast to the dull ache of exhaustion in her chest. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. A message from Michael. She hesitated before picking it up. Michael. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about today. I should have spoken up. I didn't know what to do. Annabelle stared at the screen, her jaw tightening. She typed a response, then deleted it. She knew Michael's regret was genuine. But it didn't erase the moment he'd stayed silent when his voice could have shifted the balance. Finally, she wrote, "Thank you for saying that. Let's talk more tomorrow." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step. The next day brought a new challenge. Annabelle had been invited to speak on a panel at a prestigious conference. A last-minute addition after another speaker dropped out. The topic: the future of leadership in a changing world. When she arrived at the venue, the room buzzed with anticipation. The panelists were an eclectic mix of executives, academics, and policy experts, but as Annabelle scanned the stage, she realized she was the only black woman among them. It wasn't surprising, but it was a stark reminder of how much work remained to be done. As the panel began, the moderator steered the discussion toward the usual topics: technological advancements, market trends, global policy shifts. Annabelle listened patiently, waiting for her moment. When the conversation turned to the importance of diversity and leadership, the moderator turned to her. "Ms. Hayes," he said, his tone warm but probing. "As someone who has broken barriers in your field, what advice would you give to organizations looking to diversify their leadership?" Annabelle leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table. "Diversity in leadership," she began, "isn't just about filling seats at the table. It's about dismantling the systems that decide who gets to sit there in the first place." The room grew quieter, the air thick with a tension that Annabelle recognized well. She continued, her voice steady. "Too often, organizations treat diversity as a box to check, rather than a lens through which every decision is made. It's not enough to invite people into the room. You have to ensure they're heard, respected, and valued once they're there." One of the other panelists, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit, cleared his throat. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, the word interesting carrying the faintest hint of dismissal. "But don't you think companies are already making significant strides in this area? We've seen a lot of progress in recent years." Annabelle smiled faintly, through her eyes sharpened. "Progress," she said, "is relative, for those of us who have spent our careers navigating these spaces. The progress you see can feel like a trickle rather than a wave. It's hard to celebrate strides when the barriers remain so deeply entrenched." The man shifted in his seat, his discomfort visible. Annabelle didn't let up. "The question isn't whether progress is happening. It's whether it's happening fast enough, equitably enough, and with enough accountability. And that," she added, her gaze sweeping across the audience, "requires more than good intentions. It requires structural change." After the panel, Annabelle was approached by a woman in her late 60s. Her silver hair styled neatly, her handshake firm. "I appreciated what you said up there," the woman began, her voice thoughtful. "It's not often we hear someone speak so plainly." Annabelle inclined her head. "Thank you," she said. "Plain truths can be the hardest to hear, but they're also the most necessary." The woman nodded, then hesitated. "I hope you don't mind me asking," she said carefully, "but how do you keep going? In the face of all this?" Annabelle paused, considering the question. "I think about the people who came before me," she said finally, "and the people who will come after. I know I'm part of a larger story, one that's still being written. That keeps me grounded, even when it's hard." The woman smiled, her eyes softening. "Keep going," she said. "We need voices like yours." But not everyone in the room shared the woman's sentiment. As Annabelle prepared to leave, she overheard snippets of conversation. Muted but unmistakable. "A bit intense, wasn't she? Seems like she's making it personal. She should learn to pick her battles." The words stung, but Annabelle didn't let them show. She walked out of the conference center with her head high, knowing that the discomfort she caused wasn't a flaw. It was a sign that she had struck a nerve. Later that evening, as Annabelle sat in her hotel room, she reflected on the day's events. She thought of the panel, the murmurs of dissent, and the quiet affirmations. She thought of Michael's apology and the Andersons' veiled condescension. She reached for her notebook, the one she carried everywhere, and began to write. The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out in a steady rhythm. The cost of speaking truth is often silence in return. Not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of discomfort. The kind that fills a room when people would rather avoid the mirror you hold up. But silence is not the end. It's the beginning, a space where change can take root, if we let it. When she finished, she closed the notebook and leaned back in her chair. The city lights sparkled beyond the window, a reminder that the world was vast and full of possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight. But tonight, Annabelle allowed herself a moment of stillness, a moment to remember why she fought in the first place. The cost of speaking truth was high, but the price of silence was far greater. The next morning dawned with a quiet intensity, the kind that heralded change but masked it in routine. Annabelle Hayes woke early, her body weary but her mind sharp. The conference's final day loomed ahead, and she could feel its weight in her chest. A culmination of battles fought in rooms where politeness was the weapon of choice and silence often stood as the final word. She dressed deliberately, choosing a navy suit with understated gold accents. It wasn't armor, not exactly, but it carried a message. She was prepared. She belonged, and she was unyielding. As she fastened her watch, a gift from her late father, engraved with "Stand Tall," she let the words ground her, as they always did. The final panel was titled, "Bridging the Divide: Steps Toward a More Inclusive Future." Annabelle had been asked to moderate, a move she suspected was meant to neutralize her voice by shifting her from participant to facilitator. If that was their plan, it was a mistake. The room was packed, a sea of faces ranging from eager young professionals to seasoned executives with expressions etched by years of decision-making. Annabelle scanned the crowd, noting the subtle hierarchies in their seating choices. The confident ones claimed the front. The skeptics lingered in the back. She opened the panel with a question that immediately broke the surface tension. When we talk about bridging divides, whose responsibility is it to build the bridge? And who decides what's on the other side? The panelists exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unprepared for such a direct approach. A man with a salt and pepper beard leaned into his microphone. "Well," he began, his tone measured, "I believe it's a shared responsibility. We all have a role to play." Annabelle nodded, letting the man's words settle before responding. "A shared responsibility," she repeated, her voice calm but piercing. "That assumes we all start from the same place, with the same tools. But what happens when one side holds all the materials, and the other is left to fend for themselves?" The room grew quieter, the unspoken tension thickening. A woman to Annabelle's left, a DAI consultant with a polished presentation, interjected, "That's a fair point, but I think we're making progress. We've seen companies adopt initiatives that prioritize equity. Progress is undeniable." Annabelle agreed, her tone sharp yet even. "But let's not mistake movement for momentum. For every initiative that succeeds, how many are quietly dismantled when they become inconvenient?" The air in the room shifted, an electric charge crackling beneath the surface. Annabelle pressed on, her voice steady but unrelenting. "The truth is, bridging divides isn't comfortable. It means confronting our own complicity, acknowledging the privileges we take for granted, and being willing to do more than check a box." As the panel concluded, the applause was polite but restrained, as though the audience wasn't sure whether to celebrate the conversation or retreat from its implications. Annabelle thanked the panelists and stepped down from the stage, her mind already racing with the moments she wished she'd had more time to explore. A man approached her as she gathered her notes, his tailored suit and confident stride marking him as someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Ms. Hayes," he said, extending a hand. That was provocative. Annabelle raised an eyebrow, shaking his hand firmly. Provocativeness is a matter of perspective, she replied. To some, it's true. To others, it's a challenge. The man chuckled, though it lacked humor. Fair enough, he said, but you have to admit, change takes time. You can't force people to see the world your way. Annabelle tilted her head, her gaze steady. I'm not asking them to see the world my way. I'm asking them to see the world as it is. Later that afternoon, as Annabelle walked through the conference center's atrium, she noticed a small group of young attendees gathered near the exit. One of them, a black woman in her late 20s, broke away from the group and approached Annabelle, her steps hesitant but determined. Ms. Hayes, the woman began, her voice wavering slightly. I just wanted to thank you. Hearing you speak, it felt like you were saying things I've been thinking about for years but didn't know how to put into words. Annabelle smiled warmly, her exhaustion momentarily lifting. Thank you, she said. What's your name? Danielle, the woman replied. I'm an analyst at a tech company. It's a good job, but it's hard to speak up sometimes. I feel like I'm always walking a tightrope. Annabelle nodded, her expression softening. I know that feeling well, she said, but remember, the tightrope isn't the only path. Sometimes, you have to build your own. Danielle's eyes brightened, her posture straightening. I'll try, she said. No, I will. Thank you for reminding me. That evening, as Annabelle packed for her flight home, she reflected on the moments that had defined the day. The panel, the conversations, the unspoken challenges, they all pointed to the same truth. Progress was slow, uneven, and often uncomfortable, but it was happening. She opened her notebook, the pages filled with thoughts she'd scrawled over the years. On a fresh page, she wrote, "The bridge between what is and what could be is built not by the powerful, but by the persistent. It's strengthened by every voice that refuses to be silenced, every step taken against the current, and every hand extended across the divide. The work is hard, but it's necessary, because the alternative is not just stagnation, it's surrender." Annabelle closed the notebook, her heart heavy but resolute. The work was far from over, but she was ready to continue. The echo of her words would carry on, not just in the halls of the conference center but in the minds and actions of those who had heard them. And perhaps, in those echoes, the seeds of real change would begin to take root.